Let's join together in a moment of centering silence to be more fully present with ourselves and this community. And now let's join together singing our in-gathering hymn number 377. The words are printed in your order of service. Good morning, and welcome to the First Unitarian Society of Madison. This is a community where curious seekers gather to explore spiritual, ethical, and social issues in an accepting and nurturing environment. Unitarian Universalism supports the freedom of conscience of each individual as together we seek to be a force for healing and transformation in the world. My name is Beth Binhammer, and on behalf of the congregation, I'd like to extend a special welcome to visitors. We are a welcoming congregation, so whoever you are and wherever you happen to be on your life journey, we celebrate your presence among us. Newcomers are encouraged to stay for our fellowship hour after the service, and to visit the library, which is directly across from the center doors of this auditorium. Bring your drinks and your questions. Members of our staff and lay ministry will be on hand to welcome you. You may also look for persons holding teal stoneware coffee mugs. These are FUS members knowledgeable about our faith community who would be happy to visit with you. An experienced guide is going to be available after service this morning, John Powell. He will meet with any of you who would like a tour of this wonderful national landmark meeting house right after the service. We welcome children to stay for the duration of the service. However, because it is difficult for some in attendance to here in this very lively acoustical environment, our child haven right over here to my right, and the commons are excellent places to retire if a child needs to talk or move around, or if a grown-up needs to talk and move around. The service can be seen and heard from those areas. And speaking of noise, this would be a great time to turn off your cell phones. I actually forgot mine, left mine at home, so I can't hold it up for you, but so check your electronic device. I'd like to now read the names of those wonderful volunteers who help make this service possible. This morning on sound, we have Alex Manville and David Briles. Our lay minister this morning is Tom Boykoff. Our greeter upstairs was Janine Nussbaum. Ushers are Daniel Bradley, Melinda Carr, and Marty Hollis. The coffee this morning is being prepared by Bis Nitschke and Sandra Plish. So we thank the volunteers for their service this morning. Please note the announcement in your order of service. Upcoming events at the Society are described therein. I do have a couple of additional announcements. First, today is the last day to sign up for Friday's Passover Seder. Sign-up sheets and recipes are available in the commons to the left of the kitchen. After service today, you're invited to head over to the Landmark Auditorium for a presentation by a volunteer from Wisconsin United to Amend about a national interfaith caucus, UUs, and local group working to pass an amendment affirming that only human beings and not corporations have constitutional rights, and that money is not the equivalent of political speech. Everyone is welcome, regardless of their political persuasions or familiarity with this issue, and coffee will be available. Unfortunately, our guest oboe player, Andy Olson, is ill with the flu and is unable to play for us this morning. Finally, keeping with the theme of imperfection, or an orientation toward perfection, you might want to note on the front of your order of service that it reads Sunday, April 24th. And it is not Sunday, April 24th. Again, welcome. We hope that today's service will stimulate your mind, touch your heart, and stir your spirit.
Though beautiful and bounteous, this is an imperfect place that is filled with imperfect people, with people who fail although they try to be as good and as caring, as honest and as generous as they believe they should be. How we live with our imperfections, that's what really counts. Acknowledging them, taking responsibility for them, outwitting them, forgiving them in ourselves and in others. Yes, this is an imperfect place, and we are all imperfect people, and yet we do have some amazing strengths. May we join our strengths and our affections this morning and become, for a while at least, a steadfast chain of community. I invite you to rise in body or in spirit for the lighting of our chalice. Our words of affirmation are responsive, so if you will join your voices in reading the bolded, italicized sections. Knowing how deeply our lives intertwine, we pledge not to harm or injure carelessly or with impunity.
Knowing how deeply our lives intertwine, we pledge not to take what is not given.
Knowing how deeply our lives intertwine, we pledge not to engage in abusive relationships.
Knowing how deeply our lives intertwine, we pledge not to harbor ill will toward any sentient being.
Knowing how deeply our lives intertwine, we pledge not to possess things or life forms selfishly or exclusively.
Knowing how deeply our lives intertwine, we will forgive ourselves and each other when we fail to uphold these pledges as we inevitably will.
And now, in the spirit of those intertwining lives, please turn to your neighbor and exchange with them a warm greeting. seated. And if we have some children among us who would like to come forward for the message for all ages, we'd love to see you up here. Yes. We've got children, we've got dogs, we've got black-footed ferrets, and dolls, all kinds of good things. So there are some people who seem to think that the point of being alive is to get everything right, never to make a mistake, to get all A's in school, to play baseball without ever striking out or dropping a fly ball.
I played baseball and I hit a lot of balls.
You hit a lot of balls, so you were doing really well. That's great.
Yesterday, my friends came over and we were playing baseball.
Oh, and that's not how you broke your arm, is it? No, well, that's good. But anyway, the whole idea is that we should never do anything wrong, right? Never make a mistake. If you're going to be in a play, you should never forget your lines, right? Or if you're sitting at the table, you should have perfect manners so your parents don't yell at you, right? Well, some people think that that's what we should be doing in our lives, moving as far from imperfection, from making mistakes, over to perfection, not ever making a mistake as we possibly can. Well, it is really important to try to do things right. Not making a lot of mistakes. But maybe that's not exactly the point of why we're alive, and that's what this story tells us. And this story comes from Tibet, very high mountainous area in Tibet. And in Tibet, there lived this very religious woman, and she was a Tibetan Buddhist nun. She was a nun. And this is what Tibetan Buddhist nuns look like. You see, they cut their hair very, very short, just like male monks do. And then they wear these saffron robes. Well, that's just the tradition that they have. So those are the nuns. And this woman was a nun like those women. And she was a nun who prayed every day to her favorite goddess. They call them bodhisattvas in Tibet. And this goddess was named Tara. And if you were a real, devoted to Tara, then she would give you great wisdom and compassion. And that's what this nun wanted above all else. She wanted to be a very compassionate and very wise person. So she was always praying to Tara. And this is a painting of what Tara looks like. And so this nun would get up every morning and she would go up to her roof and she would begin to pray. And just as the sun was peeking over the horizon, she would put her hands together and very, very loudly she would say her prayers so that she would make sure that Tara could hear them. And she prayed so loudly and for so long that the man who was living next door couldn't help but hear her. And as she prayed, he would kind of wince like the prayers were hurting his ears. And it wasn't because the prayers were so loud that she was wincing. It was because this nun made so many mistakes when she was praying. She never got all the words right. She mispronounced some of them. She even left some important words out. Well, how did this man know that? Well, that's because he was a scholar and he had dedicated his whole life to learning all the Buddhist prayers and being able to say them absolutely perfectly. If there was anybody else in the whole town that knew about praying, it was this particular man. But as he watched this nun praying and was wincing, something really confused him because she was praying all wrong, but as the sun was rising over the mountains, who should come walking up onto the roof to be with the nun? The goddess Tara. But she walked with a kind of a limp. What's that all about? The scholar thought to himself. Well, and why would this supremely wise person come to this ignorant nun who wasn't praying right? Well, maybe she was limping because the prayers hurt her too. Well, eventually curiosity got the best of this scholar, and so he walked next door and he knocked on the nun's door, and she let him in with a broad smile and invited him to come in. But then he said to her, I'm sorry to bother you, madam, but you know, you're not praying correctly to Tara. You're doing it all wrong. And the smile just disappeared from the nun's face, and tears welled up in her eyes. Oh, don't worry, said the scholar. I can teach you how to pray the right way. And so he began to teach the little nun, and slowly, little by little, she improved in her praying. Finally, she could say every syllable correctly, every word in the proper order, and she didn't leave any words out. But then, after a while, the scholar noticed that the nun was still up there praying every morning, but Tara wasn't coming to see her anymore. Well, what's going on with that? She's doing all the prayers right, but Tara has disappeared. And so he thought about that for a couple of days, and then he decided he was going to have to go back and pay the nun another visit. So he knocked on her door, and she let him in, and he bowed to her very, very respectfully, and he said to her, you know, I'm really sorry. I'm the one who made a big mistake. You need to go back to chanting to Tara the way that you always did before. And so with that, the nun smiled very, very happily. She thanked the scholar, and the next morning she was back on her roof praying the way that she always had, with great enthusiasm and joy and love for Tara. Her voice rang out over the mountains, and she didn't pause to think about whether she was saying it all right. And so sometimes she was making mistakes again. But the scholar heard this voice of pure love and faith for the goddess Tara. And then sure enough, within a day or two, who do you think came limping back up to the rooftop where this nun lived? It was Tara. And Tara had a smile on her face. So why do you think Tara might have been limping? I mean, she's supposed to be this great goddess, very, very wise and compassionate. Why'd she have a limp, you think? Anybody know? A limp? She kind of was walking. She couldn't walk quite straight. Like if you had a broken ankle or something. What do you think? Might have been hurt. And, you know, maybe she was kind of trying to tell the nun and everybody else that, hey, it's okay not to be perfect, that even a goddess doesn't have to be absolutely perfect. So we hope that you always do the best you can, but maybe we should think about some other goals for ourselves other than just being the most perfect person in the world. That's my story for you today, and we're going to sing you out with our next hymn, number 186. Please be seated. So we continue our service with this familiar passage from the 5th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew. Think not, Jesus said, that I have come to abolish the law and the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, Until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Whoever then relaxes one of the least of the commandments and teaches men so shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But he who does them and teaches them shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. You have heard it said that you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons and daughters of the Most High. For he makes the sun to rise on the just and the unjust, and he sends rain to both the evil and the good. You, therefore, must be perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. And then this selection from Richard Bach's Jonathan Livingston Seagull. This was first published in 1970, and it sold millions of copies. And according to Tom Butler Bowden, it belongs on the short list of timeless spiritual classics. At 250 miles per hour, Jonathan felt that he was nearing his level flight maximum speed. At 273 miles an hour, he thought that he was flying as fast as he could possibly fly, and he was ever so faintly disappointed. But there was a limit to what this new body of his could do. And although it was faster than his old level flight record, it was still a limit that would take great effort to break through. In heaven, he thought to himself, there should be no limits. In the days that followed, Jonathan saw that there was much to learn about flight in this new place, as there had been in the life behind him. But there was a difference. Here, in this place, there were gulls who thought as he thought. And for each of them, the most important thing in living was to reach out and touch perfection in that which they most loved to do, and that was to fly. They were magnificent birds, all of them, and they spent hour after hour practicing flight, testing advanced aeronautics. And one morning, Jonathan was out with his instructor, resting on the beach after a session of folded wing snap rolls. "Where is everyone, Sullivan?" he asked silently, quite at home now with the easy telepathy that these gulls used instead of their screes and gracks. "Why aren't there more of us here?" he asked. "Why, where I come from..." "Yes," said Sullivan, "thousands and thousands of gulls. The only answer I can see is that you are pretty much a 1 in a million bird, Jonathan. You know, most of us came along so slowly. You have any idea how many lives we must have gone through before we even got the first idea that there was more to life than eating or fighting or power in the flock? 1,000 lives, Jonathan. 10,000. And there are then another 100 lives until we begin to learn that there is such a thing as perfection, and another 100 lives to get the idea that the purpose in living is to find that perfection and to show it forth. The same rule holds for us now, of course. We choose our next world through what we learn in this world. Learn nothing, the next world will be just the same as this one. The same limitations, the same lead weights to overcome. Sullivan stretched his wings and turned to face the wind. "But you, John," he said, "you learned so much at one time that you didn't have to go through 1,000 lives to reach this one." One evening a few days later, the gulls stood on the sand thinking. Jonathan mustered all of his courage and walked to the elder gull, who, it was said, would soon be moving beyond this world. "Chang," he said a little nervously. The old seagull turned and looked at him kindly. "Yes, my son?" "Chang, this world isn't heaven, is it?" The elder smiled in the moonlight. "You're learning again, Jonathan Seagull." "Well, what happens from here? Where are we going? Is there such a place as heaven?" "No, Jonathan, there is no such place. You see, heaven is not a place. Heaven is not a time. Heaven is being perfect." He was silent for a moment. You're a very fast flyer, aren't you, Jonathan? I enjoy speed, said Jonathan, taken aback, but also proud that the elder had noticed. You will begin to touch heaven, Jonathan, in the moment that you touch perfect speed. Can you teach me to fly like that? Of course, if you wish to learn. I do wish. When can we start? We can start right now if you wish. I really want to fly like that, Jonathan said. Strange light flickered in his eyes. You just tell me what to do. So Richard Bach's celebrated fable, Jonathan Livingston Seagull, has now been around for almost a half a century. Upon its initial release, it spent almost 2 years on the bestseller list, and although I ignored it completely when it was popular, eventually I did procure a copy of Jonathan Livingston Seagull in the bargain bin of a used bookstore. It then lived unread on the shelf where I kept several other pieces of what I call juvenile literature. But recently I ran across an article that alluded to this book's treatment of the concept of perfection, which happens to be this month's worship theme here at FUS. And so my curiosity was kindled. But alas, a search of the neglected item turned up empty. At some point, I speculated it must have joined my discards. Perhaps it's in the remainder bin of some other used bookstore now. But as luck would have it, Jonathan Livingston Seagull is now available online as a free download. It's a very quick read, a half hour at most. And the fable really is quite fascinating. Jonathan doesn't like other seagulls. He doesn't live like other seagulls. He enjoys flying for its own sake and not as a means to some other end like procuring food. Jonathan is determined to be the best flyer in the seagull world, and he experiments with various techniques to increase his speed and his agility. Now, Jonathan's fellow gulls, they don't get it, and they expel this unconventional bird from the flock. Jonathan carries on alone, continuing to improve his flying until he breaks a sound barrier of sorts. And now he passes into another dimension where his body becomes luminous and flawless. Here he receives advanced instruction from teachers who do communicate through telepathy, and he learns of the many dimensions to which eventually he will have access. And his instructors also demonstrate that perfect flight is something that one accomplishes through mental concentration rather than physical effort. You learn to move from point A to point B in the blink of an eye, using powers of the mind that only a very few can ever acquire. One senses a little Plato here, a little Tibetan mysticism there, a dash of Carlos Castaneda, and perhaps a nod to the transporter on the Starship Enterprise. So how, according to Jonathan Livingston Seagull, does one accomplish this, achieve perfection? Apparently, it must become for the individual an unquenchable aspiration, their singular and their sole ambition. And one must have the unshakable conviction that perfection is attainable, and it is something that one is capable of reaching. And it also requires unflagging commitment, as Jonathan put it to a promising younger gull. The hardest thing in the world is to convince a bird that he is free and that he can prove it for himself if he just spend a little more time practicing. And this student is amazed by Jonathan's ability to fly using his mind. What's your secret, he asks. There's no secret, Jonathan says matter-of-factly. You just have to practice. There's one aspect of this fable that I will return to a bit later, but first let's carry this discussion of perfection a bit farther, its meaning, its history, its significance, and its appeal. The Australian philosopher John Passmore offers a useful typology that reveals the various ways in which this concept has been applied through the centuries. Richard Bach's fable falls into what he would call the teleological category. In other words, one establishes a goal. The word is telos in Greek. And then when that goal has been fully realized, perfection is at hand. And so reaching one's full potential, mastering a particular discipline like flying, this is one way to conceive of perfection. And thus the legendary golfer Bobby Jones was said to have come as close as anyone before or since to having acquired the perfect golf swing. But then there's another way of thinking about perfection, metaphysical perfection, which also finds a place in Richard Bach's fable. According to Plato, all physical objects that surround us are approximations. They are imperfect copies of ideal forms that exist at a higher level of reality. Perfection can never be absolutely attained because of the inherent limitations of physical existence. But with practice, with steady application, we can steadily narrow the gap between the real and the ideal. The perfect has also been described using aesthetic terms like harmonious, well-ordered. The proportions of the Parthenon, or of the statuary created by the ancient Greek sculptor Praxiteles. These have been held up as examples of artistic or aesthetic perfection. And this particular understanding of perfection actually ended up hindering the development of an accurate cosmology, because ancient authorities like Plato and Aristotle and Ptolemy, they were convinced that the movement of celestial bodies up in the heavens had to be harmonious, and that meant that they had to be defined by perfect circles and constant velocity. And so when Johannes Kepler offered proof that these planets followed less than perfect elliptical orders and that they traveled at varying speed, it was as if God himself had been overruled. Two other treatments of perfection can be traced back to the Bible. One is what Passmore calls immaculate perfection, which most Christian thinkers have ascribed to the Virgin Mary alone. Having been immaculately conceived, Mary was born and thought to have lived her entire life free from the fatal contamination of sin. And then finally, there is obedientary perfection. By submitting completely to God, by scrupulously obeying his every commandment, one can become the perfect servant. And when Jesus warns in Matthew's gospel that whoever relaxes even the least of these commandments shall be called the least in the kingdom of heaven, then he is speaking in favor of this kind of perfection, obedientary perfection. So what's the status of this concept today? And how seriously ought we to take it? To what degree does it still inform our thinking and our behavior? Well, in some respects, it should be actually a cause for some significant concern. Back in December, the Atlantic magazine's cover story focused on a rash of teenage suicides that have in recent years shaken the Palo Alto, California community. Students in that wealthy city's elite high schools have been killing themselves by jumping into the path of oncoming commuter trains. Palo Alto's teen suicide rate is more than 3 times the national average, and most of the victims are high achievers. Investigators point out that the pressure that kids in this community feel, and in comparable upscale communities outside of Washington, D.C. and Chicago, the anxiety that they feel, the pressure they feel is palpable. Palo Alto is, as we know, the home of Stanford, the most selective post-secondary school in America. And therefore, it is the school that these ambitious students are very, very eager to attend. Competition for placements in this school, in the Ivy Leagues, is intense. And children come of age believing that nothing less than a perfect SAT score, nothing less than a 4-point average in a course load that's heavy with advanced placement courses, nothing less than that will do. And the students' own dreams are powerfully reinforced by their parents. Julie Lithcott-Hames, a former dean at Stanford, complains that these Palo Alto parents micromanage the lives of their children, denying them any time to flail or any room to fail. And Adam Strasberg is a psychiatrist locally, and he feels that this new generation of helicopter parents imposes insidiously high educational standards on their children, driven perhaps by their own fear of falling, their own insecurity, their own dread of failure. Strasberg's solution: want the best for your child, not necessarily for your child to be the best. Now, these are folks who fall into that category of teleological perfectionists. Set for yourself the highest possible goal, and then commit yourself to attaining it heart, mind, and soul. Accept no substitutes, is the way Madison Avenue used to put it. And fulfillment then equals perfection. But you know, the culture sends a lot of mixed messages on this subject, and at least some of those mixed messages do have a religious basis. When Jesus demanded perfection, a significant number of Christians have, over the centuries, taken him literally, taken those words to heart. And this struggle over perfection, whether it represents a realistic and attainable goal, has been going on for hundreds of years. Way back in the 5th century, two theological giants, Augustine and Pelagius, debated the issue at length. Now, Augustus, as you may know, was primarily responsible for the Catholic doctrine of original sin. All human beings, without exception, come into this world mortally depraved and fatally tainted, this condition that we inherited from our fallen first parents. But for his part, Pelagius found this idea to be absurd. It's appalling. And he argued that humankind had been created expressly for perfection, and that this is where we should set our sights. If this were not true, he said, then why would Jesus have said, "Ye must be perfect"? And what Pelagius had in mind here was obedientary perfection, perfect obedience. He who believes in God, he wrote, attends to his commandments. This is the love of God, that we do what he commands. But this places a tremendous burden on the individual, the historian Peter Brown observes. Because now all of us are responsible for our every action. Every sin, therefore, can only be a deliberate act of contempt for God. Augustine was not so sure that human nature could bear so heavy a weight. This Pelagian position bears more than passing resemblance to the burden that some high-achieving, overzealous American parents place on their own children, some of whom, of course, crash and burn. Perhaps Augustine was right. This demand for perfection can be more than most of us want or are able to handle. Now, Pelagianism was condemned as a heresy at the Council of Carthage in the year 418. But it continued to influence Catholic thinking and Catholic behavior. And so cloistered monks in the Catholic tradition sought moral perfection within the sheltered life of the monastery. And Catholic doctrine has always held that one may enter a state of perfection through repeated acts of charity. It is believed possible, Elmer Clark writes, for the charitable believer to surpass the demands of the moral law and lay up an extra supply of goodness, a treasury of merit, that the church may then draw upon for the benefit of others. But then Christianity also hammers home a second message, one of human insufficiency and ultimate dependency on God's grace. We know that the law is spiritual, Paul writes in his epistle to the Romans, but I am carnal. I am sold under sin. And Paul goes on to describe the inner turmoil that he experiences in knowing what is right, but finding himself incapable of doing what is right. Wretched man that I am, he complains, who will deliver me from this body of death? His answer to that question was, of course, Jesus. Christ is the Savior because he does for us what we are constitutionally unable to do for ourselves. His was the perfect sacrifice performed on behalf of an incorrigible humanity. Now, Paul aside, Jesus himself seems to be of two minds on the subject. In the 5th chapter of Matthew, he extols this principle of perfect obedience. But then, in other places, he suggests just the opposite. He's criticized for picking grain and for performing healings on the Sabbath. And he bristles when he is charged with these offenses. Man was not made for the Sabbath, he tells the Pharisees, the Sabbath was made for man. On several occasions, Jesus complains about those who follow the letter while ignoring the spirit of the law. That, he says, is a recipe for cruelty, for insensitivity. And as we know, Jesus hung out with sinners as well as the righteous, and he was less than punctilious in his own habits. The Jewish law prescribes hand washing prior to a meal, a practice that Jesus sometimes overlooked. Challenged by his legalistic critics, he replied, "It isn't what goes into the mouth, it's what comes out of the mouth that defiles a man." So was Jesus confused? How do we account for such inconsistencies? Well, the Gospels are, of course, anything but consistent, because 4 different unrelated persons wrote the 4 Gospels. But is there a standard we can appeal to in determining what Jesus really believed about such matters? Actually, there is. Because if we look at the Gospels as a whole, it is clear that he places greater emphasis not on perfection, which is mentioned all of once in the 4 Gospels, but on love. What is the greatest of God's commandments, he was asked? Love of God and love of neighbor. He isn't talking about conditional love. He isn't talking about a love that has to be earned, that is consistent upon our meeting certain lofty standards. It's a radically inclusive love that he recommends, one that does not excuse sinful behavior or wrongdoing, but that makes certain allowances for human weakness and extends forgiveness for those acts. Perfectionism and love are like oil and water. They do not mix very well. The former, perfectionism, always implies judgment, exclusivity. Like Tara, that immortal being in the Tibetan story I shared earlier, Jesus doesn't demand perfection. He does not expect perfection. It is devotion, unselfish love, being in committed and sympathetic relationship. That, and not impeccability, that really counts. Maybe Jesus had a limp himself. In her book, Bird by Bird, Anne Lamott dismisses perfection in those that she chooses to befriend. Perfect, she says, means shallow. It means boring, fatally uninteresting. The people that Lamott relates to exhibit traits like procrastination and jealousy and addictiveness, which are all flaws that she sees in herself as well. As Jack Hayward, a late Unitarian theologian, once said, people are equal only insofar as they are fallible and in need of each other's help. Our accomplishments may make us admirable, but perhaps not as lovable as we would like, because there is something unapproachable, something intimidating about those who strike us as just a little too perfect. And so to love and to be loved, we have to present as human with all the limitations and all the lapses that are native to our species. You know, Unitarians and Universalists have wrestled with this issue as well over the years. The 19th century Unitarian minister Thomas Starr King, who served our church out in San Francisco, offered perhaps the most telling description of our 2 faith traditions. Universalists, Starr King said, think that God is too good to damn humankind forever. Unitarians, well, they think that they are too good to be damned. Our Unitarian forebears, like the ancient Pelagians, were perfectionists. They did not believe in salvation by faith or by grace. They believed in salvation by character. Universalists, on the other hand, believed in this infinitely loving deity who would leave out the latch string until the most wayward of his children was safely home. Now, we UUs are still, in my reckoning and observation, a rather ambitious lot, and we do put a premium on avoiding mistakes, doing things right, leading lives of accomplishment, and that's why we need to always be cognizant of the universalist side of our heritage, which calls on us to honor each person's inherent worth and to stand firmly on the side not of perfection, but of love. So let's return in closing to Richard Bach's fable. In the final pages, Jonathan Seagull has transcended. He can now live in this supernal dimension with other perfect and near-perfect beings. And yet, like a Buddhist bodhisattva, Jonathan chooses to return to the flock that had rejected him to teach them the secrets of transformation. One of his companions says, "Jonathan, I don't understand how you can manage to love this mob of gulls who rejected you, who even tried to kill you." Well, you don't love that, Jonathan replied. You don't love the evil and the hatred. You have to practice to see the real goal, the good in every one of them, and to help them see that goodness in themselves. That's what I mean by love. It's fun once you get the knack of it. So let us set for ourselves a similar intention, that in our own lives we will strive and we will practice until we too get the knack of loving. Blessed be and amen. In conjunction with Earth Day, we always collect funds to offset our energy use, our carbon footprint. And so this week and next, I believe, your gifts will be given to Native Energy, which helps us to accomplish that particular goal. We gather each week as a community of memory and of hope, and to this time and this place, we bring our whole and sometimes our broken selves. We carry with us the joys and sorrows of the recent past, seeking here a place where they might be received and celebrated and shared. In our Cares of the Congregation book that always sits right outside the main entrance to the auditorium, there was one entry today, and Jody Weldon marks the anniversary of her sister's death, Martha Irons Weldon, who I think died at 55 years of age, is what the message says. And she just says, "Love, honey, your sister." And in addition to that mentioned, we would acknowledge any other unexpressed joys and sorrows that might remain among us. As a community, we'll hold those with equal tenderness in our hearts. Let us sit silently for just a moment or two in the spirit of empathy and of hope. And so by virtue of our brief time together, may our burdens be lightened and our joys expanded. And now I would invite you to turn to our closing hymn, number 331, "Life is the Greatest Gift of All." Benediction and the postlude. Be kind, someone has written. Nearly everyone you meet is fighting a tough battle. The burdens of our world are many, the burdens carried by people all around us. Imperfect, stumbling, insecure people very much like ourselves. People with weaknesses, sorrows, fears, but also with incredible strengths and will and resilience. A religious community is not a gathering of saints. It is not a place where we come to showcase only our virtues and to share only our victories. There is no one among us who has not suffered loss, experienced despair, missed the mark, caused someone else pain. A religious community, composed as it is of imperfect people, it's a place where we can be, without a whole lot of pretense, a whole self. And in a congregation like this one, we must always be prepared to give support to those who trip and fall and get bruised, as each one of us is sure to do from time to time. We are here not to rescue one another, but to help in our own small way to redeem the human condition with the gift of our presence and of our caring. May it be so. Amen.